Was Cleopatra really a brilliant leader, or was she an utterly selfish queen with psychopathic tendencies? How did she really die? What was her real ethnicity? What happened to her kids? What's her connection with Jesus? And what kind of lover was this famous queen? All will be answered, and more in this fascinating show about her life. 50. As you'll see throughout our show today, Cleopatra could be a formidable ruler at times, but when it came to emotions, she was often as cold as ice. Nowhere is this more evident than in her willingness to murder those closest to her. You'll know the details of her life soon, but for now, let's just say that with the help of her lover, the great Roman dictator named Julius Caesar, Cleopatra became the pharaoh of Egypt. She then married her 12-year-old kid brother Ptolemy XIV Philopator. But in 44 BC, 3 years after they became co-rulers, things became awfully heated both in Rome and Egypt, and this poor young fella mysteriously died. It's thought Cleopatra was behind his death. This wasn't the only time she took out a person closest to her, which we'll explain later. But first, how did she kill Ptolemy XIV? 49. Historians can't be 100% sure what was used in the downfall of Ptolemy XIV, but it's thought it may have been the poison from the plant aconitum, aka wolfsbane, or the devil's helmet. This stuff alone has a fascinating past. It's highly toxic, so the ancients would sometimes use it to execute someone, and if need be, make the death look like it resulted from natural causes. Just 2 milligrams can cause death by heart failure. In 2010, a Canadian actor died on a camping trip after accidentally ingesting wolfsbane. Ptolemy XIV had no chance. But life for the ancients wasn't all about mayhem and murder. Cleopatra also knew how to have a good time. 48. People have been getting high for millennia, and for the ancient Greeks, Egyptians, and Romans, their fix of choice was usually booze. There's even a theory that when Alexander the Great died aged 32 in 323 BC, it was due to him being an alcoholic. Cleopatra was well known for throwing wild parties at the expense of Egypt. It's said when she was with her partner Mark Antony, they'd get loaded together and dress up. They'd walk around the streets of Alexandria, engaging in what was the ancient version of YouTube pranks. She and Antony would wear the clothes of slaves and wander around town in a drunken state. On her finger was a ring with the engraved word methe, intoxication. She just loved being intoxicated. Historians say she and Antony had a kind of drinking club they called inimitable livers. We'll talk more about this later in the show. Let's now discuss some basics. 47. Cleopatra was born in either 70 or 69 BC into what's called the Ptolemaic dynasty. When Alexander the Great, a Greek Macedonian, conquered Egypt, he left his friend and bodyguard in charge, a general named Ptolemy I Soter. Ptolemy took charge in 305-304 BC and reigned until 282 BC. Cleopatra came from a long line of these Ptolemies who liked to keep their bloodlines pure. They had no idea, of course, about what can go wrong when you inbreed, especially when it's brothers and sisters doing the breeding. Cleopatra's full title was Cleopatra VII Philopator. Her father was Ptolemy tuned Auletes, and her mother was likely his sister Cleopatra V. Her father wished that after he died, she and her brother Ptolemy XIII would rule Egypt together. We explain in detail later, but for now let's just say Egypt and Rome had a close relationship. When her father died, it was the great Roman general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, aka Pompey, that ensured Ptolemy XIII's wishes for Cleopatra and her brother to rule Egypt became the reality. He and Pompey had been allies for various reasons that will soon become clear, but the marriage of Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII was hardly one made in heaven. Historians say his advisors told him he should rule alone, while her advisors were good with the partnership. He resented his older sister because she had more authority than him. It didn't help that he was only 11 or 12, and she was 18. She pushed his buttons, annoying him when she had her face and not his minted-on coins. And in the end, she was chased off and landed in the safe haven of Syria. More to come on this soon. But first, here are some reasons why he might have resented her. 46. Cleopatra was known to have some degree of fluency in Greek, Egyptian, Ethiopian, Aramaic, Syriac, Median, and Parthian, as well as an Arabic language and possibly even a bit of the language of the cave dwellers, the Troglodytes. 45. She was the first of the Ptolemies to be able to speak Egyptian, which you would think was strange given they were ruling in Egypt. But they were notoriously xenophobic, so she was the only one of them that bothered to learn the native language. You might also wonder how she spoke to her Roman lovers, whose first language was Latin. The answer is, they were fluent in both Greek and Latin. In ancient Rome, people often spoke Greek, even though Latin was the official language. But just how clever was Cleopatra? 44. The answer is she was incredibly intelligent. She'd studied chemistry, medicine, agriculture, economics, law, military theory, and mercantile strategy. She also knew how to get the public on her side, being a proponent of public relations. She thought about what strategies she needed to take to stay on top, often giving tax incentives to politicians. That got behind her. She put on public spectacles with performances while giving out free stuff to the crowds. To find out who was against her, she had a network of spies. She even used ancient types of polls to ascertain what her next best move was. She was power-hungry, and as you'll see, paranoid too, with good reason perhaps. But was she good-looking? In 43, when William Shakespeare wrote Antony and Cleopatra in 1606, she was depicted as a woman of great power and great sexual power. He wrote, "Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety." Shakespeare wasn't pulling this out of thin air. In Plutarch's Life of Antony, Plutarch wrote that she may not have been as beautiful as everyone thought, but she had an irresistible charm. The Roman historian Cassius Dio called her a woman of surpassing beauty. As you'll see, this beauty of hers made her a scapegoat who was to blame for some of Rome's wars. She was also called a harlot queen who seduced good men. That's why Shakespeare wrote, "She is cunning past man's thoughts." Was she any of those things? You tell us at the end. 42. Cleopatra was also fabulously rich, and we mean stinking rich, Elon Musk rich. She was the queen of Egypt, and Egypt had vast resources including gold, salt, copper, flax, limestone, silver, and grain. It also had very lucrative trading routes. One of the reasons Caesar needed her so much was that he wanted her to help him finance his return to Rome. People have tried to come up with a number for her net worth in today's money, which has been estimated at $96 billion. But how did she ever get to meet Caesar in the first place? 41. After Caesar had crossed the Rubicon and said the now famous words, "Alea iacta esto," let the die be cast, a civil war erupted in Rome when Caesar went up against Pompey, who you'll remember was an ally of Cleopatra's dad. Caesar went in pursuit of Pompey in Hispania and left Rome in the hands of the Roman politician and General Mark Antony, who you'll hear much more about later. Pompey went to Egypt thinking King Ptolemy III, Cleopatra's brother, would take care of him, but instead Ptolemy XIII took his head and later presented it to Caesar. In fact, it was really the king's regent, the eunuch Pothinus, who did the offering. Pothinus was really the one responsible for turning brother against sister. Remember, Pompey was a really respected Roman general. Assassinating him was quite the risk. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria and Pothinus presented him with Pompey's decapitated head, Caesar was outraged. Whether this was fake outrage or a cunning plan is up for debate. Because Caesar was quite the schemer. Caesar told them to get the rest of his body so Pompey could be given a proper Roman funeral. Now Caesar had an excuse to go against Pothinus and the young king. This is how things turned out. 40. Caesar may have been smiling on the other side of his face when he broke down in tears at seeing his enemy's head, but we can't say that for sure. Still, it's noteworthy that he demanded 10 million denarii, part of a debt to Rome. He'd walked into Alexandria with an army of 3,000 men and 800 men on horseback. Such exploits are never cheap, and he also needed to head back to Rome and take care of things there. It was at this point that he offered to fix things between Cleopatra and her brother so they could rule as their father had wanted. All this time, Caesar had been staying at the Alexandrian royal quarter, which seemed like quite a liberty to the Alexandrian royals. It was during this time that Cleopatra somehow sneaked into Caesar's quarters. She and her forces had already returned from Syria at this point, but they were on the outskirts of Alexandria. What happened next is debated, but one story says Cleopatra understood Caesar had a thing for women, even though he was married. She may have sent emissaries to him, or maybe not, but she got to see him anyway, perhaps after being sneaked into his quarters in a sack or a rug. Ptolemy XIII realized his sister had been talking to Caesar and tried to ignite a riot against Caesar, but Caesar had him arrested. He again tried to convince the brother and sister to rule together, and for the other, two siblings, Arsinoe IV and Ptolemy XIII, to rule over Cyprus, which then belonged to Rome. Ptolemy XIII instead raised 20,000 soldiers to attack Caesar's 3,800 forces. This became known as the Siege of Alexandria. As this raged on, Cleopatra and Caesar were more than likely getting it on since they were trapped together. It seems Caesar became very fond of her during this time. To cut a long story short, Caesar had Pothinus imprisoned, and he was later killed, probably on the orders of Caesar. After Caesar's reinforcements arrived, Ptolemy XIII tried to flee, but later died from drowning. As for the sister, Arsinoe IV, she ended up being captured and paraded through the streets in Rome during what S called a triumph, a kind of victory parade. She was later exiled. Cleopatra was not around all this time, possibly because she was pregnant with Caesar's child. Before we get back to this story, let's have a look at some more of Cleopatra's talents. 39. She was not just politically very savvy. Cleopatra was a patron of the sciences, especially medicine, chemistry, and astronomy. This also showed her dark side. 38. It's said she loved concocting potions. As you know, she probably got rid of her brother using a potion of sorts. Historians say she would take various plant extracts dissolved in alcohol and then feed them to prisoners, noting the effect and how long it took them to die. Sure, that's rather unethical, but in a world of violence, you have to be ahead of the game. Cleopatra understood the power of chemical warfare, but man, was she brutal at times. Then again, all the Ptolemies were known for killing anyone vaguely against them, including close family. 37. We can't be too sure what poisons she used, but there's a famous painting of her that depicts her lying back on a comfortable seat as she's watching these wretched prisoners slowly die. Cleopatra and poison would one day have a much closer relationship. 36. She also tried to create cures for various diseases. In an award-winning biography, the author explains that Cleopatra tried to cure baldness. She even tried to convince Caesar to use her potion. God knows how she came up with this. But it's said she took burnt mice, some rags and a bunch of horses' teeth and mashed them up. She then mixed in some bear's grease, some deer marrow, and a bit of reed bark. When all that was ready, she mixed in the honey, which was then wiped on the bald person's head. We don't know how successful this was. We imagine no better than miracle cures presently advertised on Facebook. 35. There are also academic papers that say she created ointments for brightening the skin and made balms that were supposed to help the skin heal from injuries. Okay, now some more politics. 34. To understand Cleopatra's position, you need to know that before Caesar and her made love and produced a child, the Romans had long thought about annexing Egypt. 33. Also, long before Cleopatra was sharing a bed with Roman guys, 3 Roman politicians formed a secret alliance. They were Pompey, Caesar, and also the man said to be the richest person in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus. It was when these guys had this secret threesome that Cleopatra's father agreed to pay Rome lots and lots of money. For that, they didn't annex Egypt and instead called him a friend and ally of the Roman people. But her dad also spent wildly on himself and got into more debt, hence the money owed we mentioned earlier. He ended up increasing taxes in Egypt, which led to protests and farmer strikes. So, young Cleopatra grew up in a time of great turmoil. 32. It's not certain why, but her father might have taken her from Egypt because so many people were enraged at him for his actions. He left Egypt in exile for Rhodes. The funny part is when he was on one of the Greek islands getting a telling off by a Roman senator named Cato the Younger. The senator was sitting on the toilet at the time while being treated with laxatives. We aren't making this up, but we're not sure where Cleopatra was at this point. But Isa said on this journey of hers that she and her pop stayed for a while at Pompey's villa in the east of Rome. When the father died, his debts died with him and became the responsibility of Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy VII. 31. Marrying her brother wasn't strange at all, since the Ptolemaic dynasty had been doing it in Egypt since Ptolemy II, and his sister Arsinoe II came on the scene. But incest was not a Greek tradition at all, and, in fact, outraged Greeks. It was a bit of a scandal at the time of Ptolemy II, but by the time Cleopatra was born, it had been the norm for centuries. Okay, back to the main story of her life. 30. As you know, after the siege of Alexandria, Cleopatra was pregnant with Caesar's child. In fact, this child would be the only biological child of Caesar. He was named Caesarion after his dad. He was literally Little Caesar. His life was destined to be a rough ride. 29. With the help of Mark Antony, Caesar became the dictator of Rome, which gave him the power to sort out the problem in Egypt. He decided that the 22-year-old Cleopatra would rule Egypt with her kid brother, Ptolemy XIV. Ah, peace at last. Nope. As you know, she later poisoned him, and anyway, all the time she was supposed to be with her brother, she was staying with Caesar. Her choice was a 12-year-old kid or a 52-year-old man, and she chose 52. However, Cleopatra's choice of man may well have been an act of survival. Things then turned very dark indeed. 28. Caesar was stabbed multiple times by other senators who thought he'd gotten too big for his boots. They'd even thought about enlisting Mark Antony, but then changed their minds and wondered if killing Antony was the better option. They decided against that since Antony was well liked in Rome. On March 15, 44 BC, just 3 years after the siege of Alexandria, the conspirators made sure Mark Antony was out of the way when they stabbed Caesar 23 times in the theatre of Pompey. His last words, some say, were issued when he saw one of his killers, Brutus, who'd been someone he trusted, who he'd helped. "You too, child," he gasped as the life faded from him. Chaos was about to eclipse Rome once again, and Cleopatra was right in the thick of it. But where was she at this time? 27. She and Caesar had caused quite a scandal in Rome. They didn't hide their affair. She was living in Rome when Caesar was murdered. She had to flee Rome since her life was now in danger, but she left something of herself behind. 26. Her style and looks were the talk of the town in Rome. A modern historian wrote that so many Roman women adopted the Cleopatra look that their statuary has often been mistaken for Cleopatra herself. They wore their hair like Cleopatra and copied the pearl jewelry that the queen had often been seen wearing. This brings us to an amusing anecdote. 25. After Caesar died, she went back to Egypt. Much later, during her boozy days with her lover, Mark Antony, she made a bet with him. According to Pliny, the elder's book, Natural History, She bet Antony that she could spend 10,000 sesterces on a meal, or at least a banquet. That would be about as 20 million in today's money. She got through the meal, and not much money had been spent, but with dessert she ordered a glass of vinegar. She took off one of her priceless pearl earrings and plopped it into the vinegar. Pliny said it turned into slush, and she wolfed it down, thereby winning the bet. 24. One thing we need to say about the incest that went on is while the Greeks in Greece had frowned upon it, the Egyptian rulers embraced it. That's because in Egyptian mythology, the god Osiris marries his sister Isis, which supposedly kept the bloodline pure. On the topic of family, what did happen to Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe IV? 23. When Caesar marched her through the streets in his triumph, it seems the crowd felt sorry for her. As you probably know, Roman leaders were always careful to keep the mobs on their side. It was the custom to strangle major prisoners during the triumphs, but with the crowd's pressure, Caesar decided to spare her. It said he sent her to the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, in present-day Turkey, but not for a second did Cleopatra take her eyes off this sibling who'd tried to take her place as queen. She lived a peaceful life at that temple, but Cleopatra, it seems, was just biding her time in bringing about her ultimate downfall. We'll come back to this soon. Or 22. After the siege of Alexandria, there was more turmoil in Egypt. There was high unemployment. Germanic and Gallic Roman soldiers had been left behind and had started to pillage. Food was scarce, people suffered. If Cleopatra wasn't careful, her citizens might turn against her. 21. But she used tax strategies and foreign trade agreements to create more wealth than Egypt had seen under some of her Ptolemaic predecessors. 20. You might have wondered all this time why she killed her own brother after Caesar died. Some of you probably guessed right in thinking that it was so she and Caesar's son Caesarion could rule together. Caesarion was just 3 when he was made co-ruler. It's worth noting that because Caesar was married, he kept news of his new son secret. Historians say he may even have denied being the father in public but not in private. Meanwhile, Cleopatra, knowing she had an ace in the hole, let everyone know who the father was. She even built a Caesareum temple close to the harbor of Alexandria so people could worship him. At 19, did Cleopatra have a Caesarean section, aka a C-section? We don't think she did, but the term does originate in the Caesars. It's sometimes said Caesar himself entered the world after his mother had a C-section. In a book written in 1609, a French surgeon named Jacques Guillemot writes, Caesar was ripped out of his mother's womb at the very instant she died. Still, she didn't die in childbirth. In those days, the reason C-sections were performed was that the mother had already died, so the theory about it being Caesar's mother is wrong. Even so, the word Caesus is a form of the verb caedere, meaning cut. 18. Cleopatra's Egypt later went through more turbulence when weather patterns led to failing crops and mass hunger, which in turn resulted in inflation. Life became substantially harder for Cleopatra and her people, but what was happening in Rome was more important in terms of her survival. 17. Many of the working class who loved Caesar were unhappy and made it known. Some of these so-called plebeians went on a rampage, burning down the houses of some of the conspirators behind Caesar's assassination. 18-year-old Octavian, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, had been made heir by Caesar before his death. He became part of a new triumvirate with Antony and Lepidus. They were up against Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius. More about this later. Cleopatra played a huge role in this new schism. As you'll now see, inside Rome, there was plenty of resentment towards her. 16. When Caesar was alive and living large in Egypt, many people in Rome said the expedition was too costly. Some said the only reason he was there was because he was smitten with Cleopatra and that he'd made her ruler just to make sure she would satisfy his sexual needs. One Roman historian wrote that Caesar was very susceptible to women and that he should never have gotten involved with Cleopatra's fight for the throne. The Greek historian Appian of Alexandria went as far as to say that Caesar enjoyed himself with Cleopatra at the expense of Rome. Plutarch also criticized him. He said there was no need for that intervention of his. All these people were writing after the fact, and it's hard to know if Cleopatra's cunning and beauty were overemphasized and if Caesar's lustiness was also overblown. Still, there's no doubt in Rome that at the time of their liaisons, rumors did go around that Caesar was weak and neglected his responsibilities in the face of a wily woman. It is worth noting that a modern historian told the New Yorker that Cleopatra would not have been important if it hadn't been for Caesar. He said, "She would have been dead or exiled by her early 20s were it not for Caesar's intervention." 15. When Caesar and Cleopatra were still together in Egypt after her ascension to the throne, they both took a cruise down the Nile. It was for fun as well as for exploration. After all, no one knew where the Nile ended. Such a magnificent exploration also showed Cleopatra's people what a great ruler she was. Things were still troubled at home, though, so Caesar assigned 3 legions to protect her. Another arrived later, making it 4. They'd soon be very busy, but Caesar was also a winner in all of this. 14. Cleopatra gave him access to the Egyptian navy. It was now in the service of Rome, if need be. When they went down the Nile, there was something like 400 ships, a grand-looking sight if ever there was one. At the head of the fleet was the Thalamigos, the Ptolemies' uber-luxurious state vessel, basically a floating palace. 13. Cleopatra also sent grain to Rome in spite of crop failures and widespread hunger in Egypt. It showed Romans just how valuable Egypt was. But of course, after Caesar died, the powers in Rome still wanted their piece of Egypt. This is why Cleopatra had her hands full, and this happened next. 12. Cleopatra was in a tough position. She had to pick the right side to support in Rome, but it's no surprise she picked the new triumvirate. Still, both sides asked for her help. Historians say she waited for a while before making her decision and then sent the 4 Roman legions that Caesar had left in Egypt to Rome to support the new triumvirate. 11. She chose the right side. In 42 BC, after the forces of the triumvirate had been victorious in the battles of Philippi, Mark Antony and Octavian shared power in Rome. Lands were divided up between the victors. Caesar was now firmly replaced. Peace at last. Well, no, not really. 10. Let's go back to the past again for a while to better understand what Romans thought about Cleopatra. She stayed with Caesar for quite a long time at his villa. This was burning gossip at the time. They had many esteemed visitors, including the statesman and philosopher Cicero. He later wrote, "I detest the queen." He said she was arrogant, and he was awfully upset when she denied him a papyrus scroll he wanted from the great library of Alexandria, home to as many as 400,000 scrolls. Her time was well spent in Rome. Her astronomer helped Caesar create the Julian calendar, only replaced by our present calendar in 1582. It's hard to know if she was still there when Caesar went to Roman Spain to start a war with Pompey's sons. Nonetheless, Rome certainly got a good taste of her, and she was thought of when this next thing happened. 9. One of the turning points in Caesar's great life was at a festival when Mark Antony tried to put a crown on his head. This was unheard of course, since Rome didn't have kings. Historians say Caesar was trying to gauge how people reacted to this. He actually refused the crown, but he got to see the expressions on people's faces. Notably, though just after it happened, Cicero mocked the whole affair, basically telling people, "Watch out, that horrible woman Cleopatra is giving Caesar ideas." Now he wants a crown, like hers. 8. She commanded her own fleet when helping Octavian and Antony, but her ships hit a vicious storm, and she turned up after the battle had ended. Still, after the war, Mark Antony seemed desperate to gain an audience with her. He sent her letters, but she didn't reply. It was only after he sent a personal envoy that she agreed to meet with him. Historians say he was already desperate to meet with her, and not only because of politics and territory. He, as Caesar had been, was smitten with her. What happened next is one of the most told stories in history. 7. Cleopatra sailed on the Thalamigos, and when she arrived to meet Antony, she put on a splendid banquet for him and his men. It was the height of decadence. The partying went on for 2 days, after which Antony invited her to his own banquet, but he couldn't match her for luxury. It was during this time that Cleopatra said she was the Egyptian goddess Isis, appearing as the Greek goddess Aphrodite. She said her meeting with Antony was divine. He was the Egyptian Osiris, in the form of the Greek god wine-loving Dionysus. Antony had already been compared to this god. Today we'd call him a sex addict with a boozing problem, but back then he was godly, despite his political naivety. Notwithstanding the many faults of Antony and the overly dramatic pronouncements of Cleopatra, it seems this was a match made in heaven. Literally. Antony was obsessed with her. He'd also been obsessed with the stories of Alexander the Great. He was not a good general, but he was romantic. He also wanted Cleopatra in his bed, ASAP. They did much more, though, than have the odd romp. 6. Antony returned to Alexandria, but importantly, he did so without a fighting force behind him. This made him more trusted by the people. He was there on unselfish terms. Perhaps Antony was in love. Maybe Cleopatra was, or maybe she just knew that Antony was now the most powerful man in Rome, with him in her corner who would dare go up against her. They certainly made use of the palace beds, but they were also seen in public at military parades. As we've told you, they partied and pranked the public. They played dice and went on wild hunts together. Historians make it sound like dirty dancing for the ancients, but the reality turned out to be more like true romance, when driving off into the sunset comes with many risks. She provided him with 200 ships for battle, and later she gave birth to twins, a boy named Alexander Helios and a girl named Cleopatra Selene II, the sun and the moon. Antony did not deny that he was the father. It really did look like a match made in heaven. But things were about to get dark. In Vive, people came from far and wide to see Cleopatra, including Herod of Judea, who, in the Christian Bible, ordered all male kids under the age of 2 to be slaughtered so that the King of the Jews, Jesus, would not grow up. That bit likely never happened. But Cleopatra did meet with Herod, and she'd later come into conflict with him over the Ptolemaic territories he wanted for his new Herodian kingdom. Things got even worse for Cleopatra when Octavian married Antony's stepdaughter, Claudia, and Antony later got hitched to Octavian's sister, Octavia. This was for Rome's stability, but it made Cleopatra's rule much more uncertain. Still, even though Antony had 2 kids with his new wife, it seems Cleopatra was not at great risk, not even from Herod, who was too busy fighting elsewhere to fight with Cleopatra's forces. When the twins were 3, Antony met them for the first time. He was meeting with Cleopatra not only out of love, but because he wanted to discuss Herod, and he also wanted financing for his latest campaign against the Parthians. We'll make a long story short here. In something called the donations to Alexandria, great swathes of territory were given to Egypt. This infuriated many people in Rome. Octavian saw his chance to get the people behind him and against Antony, calling Antony anti-Roman. It certainly looked that way when Octavian took Antony's will from the temple of Vesta. It said that Caesarion was Caesar's legal heir, and Antony was leaving everything he had to his children with Cleopatra, not his Roman wife. Octavian deviously said Antony was not a bad man, but he'd been hoodwinked by that cunning Cleopatra, just as Caesar had by that enchantress from Egypt. The Senate was absolutely appalled at hearing that in his will, Antony had said he wanted to be buried with his children, not in Rome, but in Alexandria. Things got even worse when Antony divorced his Roman wife and married Cleopatra. Yet again, this woman Cleopatra had wrecked things. People screamed in the hallowed halls of the Senate and in the streets. The Senate declared war on Cleopatra, and Octavian knew that this basically meant war on Antony, exactly what he'd wanted. 4. Antony was stripped of his titles. He had some support in Rome, but in the end, he had to leave. A great fight was ahead of him. He set about getting his legions together, which added up to about 193,000 men. Cleopatra did the same with her forces. Combined, this was some army and navy Octavian was looking at vanquishing. Octavian's 200,000 legionnaires and 450 warships and transports went up against Antony's 193,000 legionnaires, plus 20,000 Ptolemaic soldiers and 600 Roman and Ptolemaic warships and transports. This became known as the War of Actium, and even though the numbers were similar on both sides, Octavian was easily the victor. It didn't help Antony that some of his own forces changed sides. It was the last civil war of the Roman Republic, a devastating affair that saw around 130,000 Roman and Egyptian men die. What followed was the Pax Romana, a period of relative Roman peace lasting 200 years. We should add that as Octavian's navy demolished Antony's off the coast of Greece, Cleopatra's vessels left the battle and went back to Egypt, with Antony soon following in her wake. But before we tell you how that went down, we need to get a few things straight. 3. History is generally some parts truth and some parts propaganda. You can hardly rely on victors to write honestly about their enemies. History, when written by official hands and sometimes even personal accounts, is like an ocean filled with the detritus of tainted propaganda. You have to sift through the propaganda to achieve some sense of purity, and even then, the truth is colored by the natural forces of faulty human perception and inbuilt bias. So, what was Cleopatra really like? It's hard to say, but we can look at her actions. If she did what historians say she did, she was a ruthless murderer. Did she really didn't have to kill her brother Ptolemy XIV, and was her sister Arsinoe really a threat that required terminating? Given what we know, she could tick a lot of boxes on the hair psychopathy checklist. Just look at the first 6 on that checklist. She ticks them all. 1. Superficial charm. 2. Grandiose sense of self-worth. 3. Need for stimulation, proneness to boredom. 4. Pathological lying. 5. Cunning, manipulative. 6. Lack of remorse or guilt. The list goes on. Promiscuity, sure. Parasitic lifestyle, no doubt. Poor behavior controls, yep. Impulsivity, correct. Irresponsibility, big time. This is more apparent when you understand more about her actions. She treated her country's treasury like it was her private bank account. One of her biographers says she ran her bureaucracy like paranoid Soviet leaders. As you know, her spies were everywhere. She was ruthless, and she thought that was her birthright. If you didn't show her deference, you paid in blood. As you know, she had the ego of a spoiled Hollywood brat child, telling people she was a god. She loved her own reflection and was very likely arrogant, as Cicero said she was. Let's remember that during his lifetime, Cicero spoke about using reason over violence and was an outspoken supporter of the poor and disadvantaged. Maybe what he saw in Cleopatra was a Machiavellian brat obsessed with material goods. Incidentally, Mark Antony ended up having Cicero executed and his hands and head nailed to the rostra in the Forum Romanum. All we're saying is there are different ways to look at Cleopatra, so her status as a majestic heroine has to be taken with the same pinch of salt as should her status of an evil queen. Like all humans, Cleopatra would have been a complex person with a very nuanced personality. But what happened to her and her children? 2. During the war, Cleopatra sent Caesarion off to India. But after the war was over, Octavian managed to persuade him to come back to Rome, where he said it was safe. Octavian also officially annexed Egypt, ending dynastic rule. It's written that Octavian later said, "Too many Caesars is not good." He believed he was the true heir of Caesar, and he had Caesarion executed. As you know, Cleopatra and Antony's twins were forced to be paraded through the streets during Octavian's triumph in Rome. They were dressed as the sun and moon, and an effigy of their mother was beside them. We don't know what happened to the boy as he vanishes from the historical record. Still, we do know that the girl was educated in Octavian's wife's household, and ended up becoming a powerful woman after marrying King Juba II of Numidia, northwest Africa. She had 2 kids of her own, but died at the age of 35. Ptolemy Philadelphus, who was Cleopatra's youngest, also a son of Mark Antony, was educated with the other kids, but he too just goes missing from the historical record. As for Mark Antony, there's so much speculation about his death. It might be a case of when you're faced with either printing the truth or the legend, print the legend. That legend is that after Antony wrongly heard that Cleopatra was dead, in his crippled emotional state, he almost died. YouTube won't let us say how. He was then taken to a monument of Cleopatra and died at her bosom. Had that not happened, he would certainly have been captured and executed in front of many people. Cleopatra was captured after Octavian had walked into her palace and seized her 3 kids. It's written that she said to him, "I will not be led in a triumph." She did not want to be paraded around like a prize prisoner, only to be killed in front of joyous crowds. She died there in Alexandria, but who knows how? Cassius Dio wrote, "No one knows clearly in what way she perished, for the only marks on her body were slight pricks on the arm." Many stories have been told. One says she allowed herself to be bitten by a snake called an asp, or perhaps it was a cobra, but historians point out that the chances of a snake being there with her in her confinement are slim. Maybe she was given a special drink, just as she'd done to others in her time. The story goes that Octavian had allowed Cleopatra to give Antony a proper burial, and when she died, Octavian buried them together as she'd asked. Their tomb has never been found. The ending might not have been that romantic. Who knows? Maybe Octavian just fed them to the wolves, but such a story would not have had the same propagandistic appeal. The last thing we'll discuss is Cleopatra's bloodline. Many people have been talking about that lately. It's not highly debated, as some people say. Her bloodline was Greek-Macedonian, with a small chance she had some native Egyptian blood, or maybe some Persian blood, but she was a European woman of mostly Greek origin. She was the product of generations of incest, lucky to have been born without serious health problems. Still, we don't know how inbreeding affected others in her dynasty, because there are no medical records of the Ptolemies. We do know inbreeding led to disasters for the Egyptians, including King Tutankhamun. You can see her true origin in this next video, the real origin of Cleopatra, or have a closer look at Caesar's life in Insane Way Julius Caesar Was Actually Assassinated.